All right, chapter 6, realms of cognition in middle childhood. So learning objectives describe brain development and concomitant cognitive and behavioral changes in middle adulthood or middle childhood and explain atypical variations such as ADHD. Discuss theoretical views of cognitive development that examine conceptual change, logical reasoning, memory, and executive functions in middle childhood, and identify contextual factors that influence children's cognitive and academic growth, and analyze children's progress in developing social cognition with specific focus on perspective taking and psychosocial competencies, and suggest relevant therapeutic interventions. So, brain and behavior. So, epigenetic process of brain development continues in middle childhood. There's an increase in the white matter in the brain. It's called white because of the myelin sheaths that are involved. There's greater connectivity between the left and right cortical hemispheres, right? So your gap down the middle of your brain is getting more connections across it. There's gross motor and fine motor coordination that is a resulting benefit of that greater connectivity. Atypical variations in development account for differences in cognitive and behavioral development, like ADHD. It may be due to a delay in growth of the cerebral cortex. Interestingly, whenever I was in my master's program for counseling, one of my professors, Dr. July, had us read a very interesting article that was thought-provoking, and it was titled ADHD, a real diagnosis or a label for a normative part of childhood development. It's a very interesting perspective to take because yes, children do have hyperactivity and a lot more energy than adults typically do. And I had another professor that is, I think in his 70s or 80s now, that talked about growing up on a farm in Kansas and how when he was younger, there was no such thing as ADHD because kids were outside working all day and exercising and sweating, burning calories, and they'd be so tired they would just go to sleep at night. There wouldn't be this hyperactivity, this restlessness, excess energy, all these things. So it's just something a little interesting, food for thought, but looking at it from a brain perspective, it talks about growth of the cerebral cortex being a potential cause. There's also unevenness in children's brain development that is to be expected. Cognitive development. So Piaget's view, this is where the emergence of concrete operation starts taking place. And you might remember the cognitive development image I put in the previous slides. So in Piaget's view, we assimilate new information and accommodate existing schemas. We have the ability to decenter and we identify reversible relationships. We solve problems with concrete solutions and can think logically. There are limitations in understanding abstract concepts, and the level of logical reasoning is somewhat domain specific. So it can be applicable to a particular area of knowledge, and it's influenced by a child's interests, knowledge, and experiences. So an alternative perspective, the information processing approach. So it compares cognitive functioning to a computer's processing of information. There's no qualitative stage-like changes. So changes occur in amount and efficiency of a child's processing. Processing strategies are considered to be domain specific, and executive functions, EFs, that guide information flow include working memory, self-regulation, and cognitive flexibility. So EFs improve through middle childhood, are influenced by genetics and social, cultural, and educational experiences. And this is a bottom-up process that bypasses the working memory. And then top-down processes are intentional, deliberative, and they're governed by executive functions. So this is a chart that I found on the internet. If anybody is ever wanting the images that I put into these slideshows, y'all can just Google the images, or you can get the little links. I put the links right here. You can pause the video and type it into your browser. But I usually find the images that I do for these slides by Googling child development theories and then go to images, and then you'll find a bunch of different things. So I'll pick usually the one that I like the most, and that's how I pick those. But theoretical approaches. So here's some different ones. So the maturation approach by Arnold Giselle, 1880-1961. His principle for child development is that growth and development occur in orderly stages and sequence. The individual genetic timetable affects rate of maturation. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, has a psychodynamic theoretical approach in which he states that behavior is controlled by unconscious urges, and the three components of the mind are the id, ego, and superego. Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, 1896 to 1980 and 1934, respectively. Theoretical approaches the psychosocial stages of development. So the personality develops in 8 stages throughout a lifetime. Development is influenced through interactions with family, friends, and culture, right? So it's going to have the ego identity versus development, the identity integrity versus despair, all those different stages. Cognitive approach by Erik Erikson, 1902 to 1994. Qualitative changes in the way children think. The child is considered an active learner going through stages. Wait, that's Erikson's model, not the Piaget-Vygotsky one. But anyways, behaviorist is the next one, theoretical approach. Learning is gradual and continuous. Development is a sequence of specific conditional behaviors. Main emphasis is on the environment, not heredity. Observable behaviors are considered most important. John Watson Skinner and Albert Bandura are the theorists behind that. Uri Bronfenbrenner, 1917 to 2005, is the ecological theoretical approach. And the principles of that theory, there's balance between nature and nurture. The child is placed in the middle of concentric factors which all influence the child. Emphasis is placed both on environment and heredity. And lastly, information processing theory, developed by Noam Chomsky. We all have an innate learning ability. Children are born with specialized information processing abilities that enable them to figure out the structure of development. Okay. Oh, and also another idea, if anybody is a Mac user, you can press Command-Shift-3 and do screenshots of these slides, and you just copy paste it into notes that you're taking. Or if you're on a Windows computer, you could do, I think it's Control Print Screen, and that'll take a snapshot of the image and you can paste it into Word or into Paint and cut the image if you would like that. Okay, other approaches to understanding cognitive development, neo-Piagetians. I guess that's how you say that. They combine information processing concepts with Piaget stages to revise the stages. Transitions from one stage to another are based on changes in capacity of working memory. The level of problem solving ability is based on processing load and number of variables involved. Theory theorists have a belief in humans' innate knowledge, ability to construct theories about how the world works. So they naturally have an ability to be able to do that. Constructivists, they are constructivists who believe that executive functions are instrumental in reconstructing the child's understanding over time. So here's a little image that I found. I like it because it kind of gives a view of how different theories fall into different categories. So under the behavioralist learning, you got direct instruction, programmed instruction, and social learning theory. Under cognitivism, you've got attribution, elaboration, cognitive development, and conditions of learning, which this is maybe going beyond your book, but it's just good stuff to know. Humanism theory, experiential learning, it's like learning through experience. And then constructivism has a lot of pieces here. Social development, case-based learning, cognitive apprenticeship, discovery, problem-based learning, situated learning, activity theory, and actor network theory. Like I said, I think this is going beyond your textbook, but it's just showing you guys all the different theories. There's many more beyond just this slide that do exist. Focusing on memory, terminology. So terminology related to memory. So sensory memory has to do with brief retention of sensory memory. So the senses, hearing, smelling, tasting, seeing, touching. Working memory is a short-term storage unit. It allows for focusing your attention, planning, problem solving, and making inferences. It uses input from your sensory memory and from long-term storage. However, it has limited capacity, and you can use rehearsal to keep information in focus. So if I remember correctly, it was in my cognitive development class at the University of Texas at Austin, where our professor challenged us to remember as many numbers off of the screen. He had like 7, 8, 2, 4, 9, 3, 6, 8, 1, 3, 9, whatever. It was like 9 numbers. And he said, I want everybody to stare at these for 30 seconds and I want you to see how many you can remember. And he's like, somebody raise your hand and tell me how many you can get after like a minute of thinking about it. And only like one person could get 7. And the average number of numbers that we can that we can hold in our memory is 5 to 7. So it's pretty interesting. Working memory, it's part of that ability. In terms of learning involves storage of information and retrieval from that storage. So recognition is where we immediately remember something. It's available to our senses, and recall is information that has to be drawn out of long-term memory in order to be used. So kinds of information storage. So there's declarative, which is knowledge about facts and events. And there's some subtypes. So semantic information is factual information, rules, concepts. They have meaning. Semantic. Episodic involves memories of episodes of events. It's organized around time and space. So episodic, episodes, you remember episodes of your life, memories of things, right? And script is schematic representation of features of a reoccurring event. So remembering like the lines and the events of a play, right? You remember the script, right? Non-declarative information storage may not enter our awareness. It includes procedural knowledge and physical skills that are based on unconscious knowledge. So here's an image with some spelling errors. I didn't make this myself. So memory, you've got declarative, and then you've got episodic, semantic, and spatial, right? And then the non-declarative has associative, procedural, non-associative, and priming. There's an A missing in those associatives. And under associative memory, you've got classical and instrumental conditioning. And then the non-associative, you've got habituation and adaptation that are part of that process. Just another image for you guys to look at. And then I am a dork and like knowing things that different parts of the brain know how to do. So in looking at lobes of the brain that do different things with regard to memory. So for declarative explicit memory involving facts and events, that's involving your medial temporal lobe or your diencephalon. For a non-declarative memory, which is also known as implicit, skills and habits have to do with the striatum. Priming and perceptual learning have to do with your neocortex. Simple classical conditioning with emotional responses, it involves the amygdala, and for skeletal responses, it's going to be the cerebellum. And lastly, non-associative learning is going to be the reflex pathways. Little fun facts about the brain. Okay, so some more explanation of what's implicit versus explicit. So implicit memory is early maturing. It begins in vitro. So when you're still in your mother's womb, you are having early implicit memory that's occurring. It's non-episodic. It's general. Beliefs are generalized. It's based in abstract, and it's automatic. Explicit memories, which remembering explicit means declarative, implicit means non-declarative. So implicit, right? Non-declarative, explicit, declarative. Late maturing, it begins developing when you're 18 to 24 months old. It's episodic, so you're aware of the time and the place. It's specific to events and situations individually. It's not just generalized thinking. It's concrete thinking, and it's strategic memory. More implicit, it's context-free. There might be all or nothing thinking. So it's this way or it's this way. There's no gray area in between. It's perception focused, that's misspelled, incidental and non-associative. And then explicit memory, which explicit is which kind? Declarative. Context dependent. It's not all or nothing, it's contest, it's contestable, it depends. Depends on the context, depends on in between or not. The function and meaning is the focus instead of perception. It's intentional memory instead of incidental, and it's associative rather than non-associative. So explicit is declarative or non-declarative. Declarative. And implicit is declarative or non-declarative. Non-declarative. So focus on memory. What improves with development? So working memory expands and capacity for learning expands. Processing speed increases with practice and maturation, breadth and depth of knowledge base, the ability to chunk information. So you have knowledge in a domain, and that makes additional learning easier and quicker because you're like building on a foundation instead of starting with nothing, right? You can build on it. So it makes it easier to remember, right? So because we know how to do addition and subtraction, it makes long division an easier math to do, right? Like that's an example. We have logical thinking skills that improve with development. We gain better understanding. We can remember more. We develop language skills and coherent narrative skills. We get bigger vocabulary. Memory strategies, including organization, elaboration, and rehearsal, come into play. And metacognition is we have knowledge of and we can reflect on our own thinking. So I can think about my thinking instead of just plain thinking about blue. I can think about, why do I like blue? Right? You can think about your thinking. And in looking at these things, why are these important for a counseling student? You want to be able to understand where your client is at developmentally when you're working with them, right? So I'm not going to give a 5-year-old the same worksheet that I give a 28-year-old. Just not, like, intellectually not going to do that, right? Because they're not in the same place, but also cognitively, they're not developed to the same place. That 5-year-old doesn't have abstract thinking skills like that 28-year-old would, or logical thinking skills, or that same working memory, or that same metacognition where I can ask a difficult question and tell them to reflect and give me back an answer, right? So you want to be thinking about the cognitive development of your client when you're working with them so that you don't give them information or counseling that is above their understanding or their ability to rationalize or reason with. And also, if you've got someone with a traumatic brain injury, it can be useful to know, like, okay, does this person have a traumatic brain injury that brought them back to age 8? Does this person have autism spectrum disorder or intellectual development disorder that makes them age 9? Well, how would you know that? You would know based on their cognitive abilities, right? What's their memory like? What's their all these different things? So those can all be useful informations for you when working with clients in that way, so you can know how impaired they are or are not. Or if they're if they have any what's what we're looking for, not learned helplessness, not stunted maturation. That's what I was looking for. So you could see some stunted maturation in somebody as a result of severe codependency in the home. It could also be resultant of and codependency of the child on the parents or the parents on the child. It could be Munchausen's by proxy, which if y'all haven't learned about that, there was a case with this girl named Gypsy whose mother had Munchausen's by proxy. And what that is where a parent severely needs to be needed and believes that their child is sick, and they will give them medications and take them to doctor's appointments because they believe that they're sick or they want them to be sick. And Gypsy, spoiler alert, if you don't know the case, she ended up killing her mother because for years she was forcing her to be in a wheelchair when she really didn't need to be, even to the point that she was getting chemotherapy for cancer she didn't have. And it was making her really sick and she couldn't take it anymore. And she killed her mom in a coordinated effort with her boyfriend. And she's now in prison. I don't know that she ever got out, but when interviewed, she said she doesn't regret it because she was imprisoned in the wheelchair and in the house that she lived in with her mother. She like shaved her hair off and did all these things. It was really, really bad. But in the case of somebody with a codependent parent or Munchausen by proxy, you might have really stunted maturation because you're not afforded the opportunities to learn to be mature or to learn different skills for your own self. Or if a person uses drugs or alcohol at a very young age, that can lend to stunted maturation, where if I started smoking weed at age 12 and I'm 30 now, and I decided to stop smoking weed, I would have the emotional maturity of a 12-year-old, because from 12 to now, I've never had to learn emotional coping skills or had to mature emotionally because I use substances to cope with my feelings, perhaps, right? And so my emotion maturity is stuck at the age at which I started using substances. So if you've got an 18-year-old, 16-year-old acting like they're 10, and that's when they started using substances, that can be a major indicator of where that came from, is that they have stunted maturation as a result of their substance use. I've met people in their 40s that act like they're 15, and it's because of that very reason. They drank since they were a teenager and never stopped, right? So absolutely, brain function plays a role in what we do as licensed counselors. So cognitive development, formal schooling. So there's a range of factors associated with academic achievement. Child's executive function, school experiences, teacher interactions, and broader community and culture, and even government policy affect academic achievement. Educational factors that promote cognitive and academic growth include quantity of time in educational settings and the quantity of learning opportunities. So do they have a lot of learning opportunities? Do they have access to the lab? Do they have access to computers or none of that stuff? I know that in the last few years, my high school got a robotics lab, which how cool is that? They didn't have that when I was there. But it definitely affords a really great scientific opportunity for students interested in science, right? So not every school has a robotics lab as far as I know. Stimulating and engaging environments in the family and societal educational levels. How big is your class? Are teacher-child relationships good? Are they distant? Are they non-existent? Is your class 50 kids? Is it 5? Are you in a private school? Are you in a public school? Are you homeschooled? Do you have few friends only from church? Do you have a lot of friends because you go to a very huge public school with 5,000 kids, right? My high school had close to 4,000, and then the rival high school had over 4,000. Is very big schools. And those can make a difference in how you learn, right? Do you get that one-on-one time that you might need from a teacher to learn reading, writing, math, whatever it is? And then another educational factor is valuing learning and valuing the child as a learner. If the education of a child is important in a particular culture or family, or if there's challenging work, or if there are supports, those things all can affect the cognitive and academic growth of a child. So adding to that, right? So the family, so do mom and dad have a PhD, law degree, MBA? Did they graduate with a bachelor's? Do they only have associate's degrees? Did they graduate high school? Did they both drop out of high school? These things are going to affect how a child might be growing cognitively or academically, right? Do they go home and mom and dad checks their homework and make sure they're doing it, or mom and dad passed out, drunk, high? Are they absent? Are they working really late hours? So there's only a nanny and the nanny's the one doing the teaching. Maybe the nanny's not very talented, or maybe she is, and they were getting a great education or a really bad one. Or maybe they come home to an empty house because mom and dad work all the time and they're having to hold themselves completely accountable, right? These are all different things that are going to affect cognitive academic growth of a child. So what proximal interactions are most effective? So teacher factors, warmth and high expectations for each child are most effective. Authoritative teaching is similar to authoritative parenting. It's caring, respectful, engaging, listening, and explaining that is involved. There's challenging work, specific feedback, cooperative tasks, and a growth mindset about intelligence is had rather than an ability mindset. I want you to grow rather than just to be able to do whatever it is, building on the lessons learned. There's use of up-to-date knowledge of skills and tailoring of tasks for students' needs. So not every single kid gets the same worksheet because maybe not every single kid learns the same way. So there's combined use of memorization of facts with effective strategies and procedures that promote understanding, and you probe students' comprehension and scaffold effectively. Social cognition. So this involves understanding people and having reasoning about social relationships. There's increase in interaction that prompts growth and perspective taking for children in the middle childhood age. Parent-child relationships contribute to that growth, and interactions with siblings also contribute. Interestingly, a lot of people don't think about this, but a person, if they have siblings, their siblings are their first experience of peers in the world. And that's why you might notice that siblings test out jokes on each other. They test out pranks, they push buttons, they test limits, because their peers, their closest peers, are their siblings, right? And there's an assumption that, well, no matter what I do, they're still going to be here. So I'm going to test this thing out, and before I go take it out into the world with these other people, right? So that's why you might see siblings pushing each other's buttons a lot and doing a lot of that testing stuff and doing a lot of weird, odd things with each other. And yeah, those interactions lend to social cognition, social development. And then also developing, maintaining friendships requires perspective taking. So when there are problems, there might be too much coercion of people to be one's friend, or too little assertiveness, so too passive. So too aggressive or too passive might be the problem. Egocentrism can be a negative force in understanding others. So if you're too self-centered or too focused on the self, you might not be very empathetic to others or very understanding of others. And then with friendships, there's context for growth in perspective taking. Friendships are a context for growth in perspective taking. So give and take relationships, instead of only having giving relationships or only having taking relationships where you're constantly giving or you're constantly taking from others, right? So Selman stages of friendship development in perspective taking, stages 0 through 4. So age 3 through 6 is undifferentiated egocentric stage. Stage 1, age 5 to 9, differentiated and subjective. Stage 2, 8 to 12, is reciprocal and self-reflective. Stage 3 is 10 to 15 years old and is a mutual third person stage. Stage 4 is late teen adulthood, and it involves intimate and in-depth societal implications. Each new level of perspective taking leads to greater understanding of friendship, conflict resolution skills, and clarification of interpersonal values. So Selman stages of perspective taking. So of course I have a graph or an image because I love images. So looking at the egocentric viewpoint 3 to 5. So offering you guys some descriptions here. The child has a sense of differentiation of self and other, but fails to distinguish between the societal or the social perspective of thoughts and feelings of other and self. The child can label others over feelings, but does not see the cause and effect relation of reasons to social actions. Okay. So the social informational perspective taking, this is stage 1. So purple, the child is aware that others have a social perspective based on how others have their own reasoning, which may or may not be similar to the child's. However, the child tends to focus on their own perspective rather than trying to coordinate viewpoints, like get on the same page and understand why they think the way they do. No, they're just going to maintain what they think because that's what they think. Stage 2, self-reflective perspective taking, ages 8 to 10. The child is conscious that each individual is aware of the other's perspective, and that this awareness influences self's and others' view of each other. Putting self in others' place is a way of judging others' intentions, purposes, and actions. The child can form a coordinated chain of perspectives, but cannot yet abstract from this process to the level of simultaneous mutuality. Stage 3, mutual perspective taking, ages 10 to 12. Adolescent realizes that both self and other can view each other mutually and simultaneously as subjects. The adolescent can step outside the two-person dyad and view the interaction from a third-person perspective. And lastly, stage 4 is social and conventional system perspective taking, ages 12 to 15. The adolescent realizes mutual perspective taking does not always lead to complete understanding. Social conventions are seen as necessary because they are understood by all members of the group, the generalized other, regardless of their position, role, or experience. Okay. Moving along. So Selman's framework for friendship, interacting influences on children's making and keeping friends. So biologically based characteristics can affect friend keeping ability. So what is the child's temperament? What are their motor abilities, right? They coordinated or not? Nature of family and neighborhood culture can also have an influence on making and keeping friends, right? So is a family super private, closed off, no one's allowed to come over, no one's coming in my house, maybe there's paranoia in mom or dad, or maybe mom or dad's a hoarder and there's a lot of belongings in that house and there's a lot of family shame over that, and they don't want friends coming over because of the smell or the clutter or the biohazard that exists in their home. Or maybe the neighborhood culture is that everybody stays in their house and no one ever has anybody over. Or maybe it's quite the opposite. Maybe your family's always hosting people, having people over, charcuterie boards, drinks, snacks, they're having potluck, pot whatever, and they're having a barbecue and they're having people over to swim and the front door is always unlocked and everybody on the street knows each other and hangs out in each other's yard, right? Like what's the neighborhood / family culture that can affect a kid's ability to make friends and keep them. And it's also a social piece that they're learning about the importance of relationship from their environment, right? Processes, and actually one thing I'll add is that you might see that a child goes completely opposite of the culture that they grow up in. So maybe they have a family that's super private, but they don't like that and they want to be extroverted and make a bunch of friends. Or maybe the family's super extroverted, but they're kind of more introverted and they want to stay in their room and stay away from people. So, that has to do with temperament, right? Processes that make up psychosocial development, friendship understanding, knowing what friendship implies. So have they learned what it means to be a friend, right? Do they know what that is or not? Friendship skills, appropriate assertiveness, communication, conflict resolution, which enhances friendships. Friendship valuing, which involves emotional attachment and investment, right? Or do they find their friends to be important? Do they actually attach to them? Or do they see them as people to be used, which would indicate lack of emotional attachment, perhaps? Interpersonal orientation, is there balance between intimacy and autonomy? Other transforming, self-transforming interaction styles. Are they trying to transform others or only transform themselves in their interactions? Applications with cognitive developments, it's important to children's social success. You want to recognize their constructive process of learning. So basic elements of instruction involve attention, motivation, activating prior knowledge, meaningful presentation of content, and practicing. And then you want to give task-specific feedback and use techniques such as cooperative learning. Principles of intervention to improve children's executive functions include providing practice of skills in appropriate doses and refreshing them to retain, right? So you don't practice a football play just once. You don't practice a volleyball swing only once. You don't practice a cheerleading routine once. You don't practice your chess game one time. You practice and practice and practice, and you redo it to retain that information and compound that knowledge so it becomes more concretized. And you can combine exercise with mental challenge. That can be really good to do kinetic learning. And then you can address conditions such as stress that negatively affect executive functions as a way to help them better remember things, because we don't remember things as well if we're stressed when we're learning. We learn better when we're in a relaxed state instead of being in fight or flight mode. So executive functioning, here are some different aspects of executive functioning. What does that have to do with the prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning, right? So I'm just going to start with the number one right here. It's like a purplish brown mauve-y kind of color. Impulse control. So that involves thinking before acting. Emotional control is keeping your feelings in check. Flexible thinking is adjusting your behavior to unexpected changes. So are you able to be flexible and adapt? Working memory is keeping key information in your mind and using it, right? So I was mentioning the numbers. Can you remember the 8492773, whatever the numbers are, to use it for the quiz in 5 minutes? Self-monitoring is self-awareness to how one is doing in the moment. So is that self-awareness there, self-mindfulness? Planning and prioritizing, which involves setting and meeting of one's goals. Task initiation, which involves taking action to get started on tasks. And organization, keep track of things physically and mentally. Why is this important? We want to know if our client is developmentally delayed, if they're incapable of doing these things, or if somebody has a traumatic brain injury to the front of their brain. If these different behaviors are impaired, that's good information to know. You can work with them on these things. Or if you notice that a client has these functions and they start to decline, what could that indicate? That could indicate that there's a tumor in their brain. That could indicate there might be some kind of brain bleed or an aneurysm or some other kind of something going on in their brain. Or maybe they're not getting good blood flow and there might be a blood clot. There could be all kinds of things. So knowing what the brain's supposed to be able to do can help you decipher when someone's acting off, and you can make appropriate referral. Hey, you should go see a neurologist for a CT of your head or an MRI, or I think you should go see a hematologist about your blood clot medication, because I think there's might be something affecting your cognitive function, right? So this useful stuff whenever you're working with somebody, because, we're mental health professionals, but important to recognize the word health is in there. Part of what we're supposed to be able to do is help people with management of their health. Maybe not every single thing. We're not prescribing medications necessarily, but we can educate and provide appropriate referral when we acknowledge or we can see, hey, that looks like that might be this, that, or the other. I think you should see a doctor, or this sounds like it might be that. Okay, so application, social and emotional learning, SEL. So it's the process through which children and adults acquire, effectively apply the following knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So they understand and manage emotions and make responsible decisions. This is like that image we were just looking at. They set and achieve positive goals. They feel and show empathy for others, and they establish and maintain positive relationships. SEL programs, social and emotional learning programs, benefit academic achievement with lessons because they promote emotional literacy, self-control, and social problem solving. So think about that. Why would self-control, social problem solving be something that would help me academically? I can better focus. I can better get my work done. I can better get my homework done. I'm not going to have stressful social interactions at school that might distract me from getting my assignments completed or focusing in class. Right? They also assess and teach metacognitive skills during interventions. So metacognitive, thinking about your thinking, right? Which improves perspective taking and problem solving. So use of self-talk to clarify feelings and behaviors also helps with that metacognitive skill. So social and emotional learning, images as usual. So self-management involves managing emotions and behaviors to achieve one's goals, starting in the yellow, going clockwise. Self-awareness involves recognizing one's emotions and values, as well as one's strengths and challenges. Responsible decision-making involves making ethical, constructive choices about personal and social behavior. Relationship skills have to do with forming positive relationships, working in teams, dealing effectively with conflict. And social awareness involves showing understanding and empathy for others. So this is the social and emotional learning that the last slide was discussing. The end of the slides. Now time for questions. Okay. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, which negatively affects children's school performance, is linked to atypical variations in brain development. What is the incidence of ADHD among school-age children? Less than 1%, 5 to 10%, 2 to 3%, or more than 15%? This would be something coming from your textbook. Which one is it? Five to 10%. What cognitive ability do children develop in middle childhood that empowers or enables them to answer conservation questions correctly, like those posed by Piaget, and to think reversibly? The ability to count, of metacognition, to think abstractly, or to decenter. A, B, C, or D. D, ability to decenter. Information processing theories of cognitive development focus on what? Physiological changes in the brain, mechanics of thinking, relationships between cognitive and physiological achievements, or stages of cognitive development. Information processing theories. Mechanics of thinking, B. What type of memory has the same unchanging capacity at different ages of development? Short-term, sensory, working, or procedural memory? Sensory, B. When a child has repeated experiences with one kind of event, such as going to a ball game several times or going to the doctor several times, the child begins to form a schematic representation of the features of the event, the order in which things occur, where and when they occur. Such an episodic representation is called what? Procedural information, a script, a sensory input, or non-declarative information. A script. Piaget's seriation task demonstrates which of the cognitive changes that benefits memory with age. Processing speed, knowledge base, metacognitive skills, or logical thinking skills. Seriation task, seriation task. This is going to come from the book too. Logical thinking skills. At approximately what age do children begin to demonstrate Selman's second stage of friendship and learn that the needs and perspectives of other persons must be considered carefully? Age 5, 8, 11, or 14? Eight. Imagine that you are counseling a sixth grader on how to improve her study skills so that she will remember more information on tests. Not only do you teach her some memory strategies, you also encourage her to engage in self-testing so that she will begin self-monitoring. That is, keeping track of how well she is remembering new material. What kind of skill is this type of self-monitoring? A metacognitive, pre-operational, declarative memory, or social cognitive skill? A metacognitive skill. Thinking about her thinking, right? For counselors who work with abused and maltreated children, which of the following statements draws an appropriate conclusion from research on social cognition and friendships? A, counselors should employ group counseling because abused children can relate best to other maltreated children. B, individual classroom accommodations are most helpful because these children typically lag behind their peers academically, and this help will do most to bolster their self-esteem. C, the counselor needs to serve as the attachment figure so that these children can form an attachment and develop empathy for others. D, counselors should pay attention to the social world of these maltreated children because those who can make a best friend have a good chance of improving their self-esteem. A, B, C, or D? Which one is an appropriate conclusion on social cognition and friendships for abused and maltreated children? D, pay attention to their social world. So it's what you would call a protective factor that they're able to make friends. Selman describes the stages in the development of both perspective taking and skill and of friendship. Suppose that David understands that his friend Mike has a different perspective from his own, but David cannot yet judge how his own behavior is likely to be viewed by his friend. David is most likely in which of Selman's stages? Stage 0, 1, 2, or 3? Stage 1, differentiated but subjective. Differentiated and subjective, excuse me. Okay, now this is something new I'm going to be doing on the end of these slides, and it's totally optional, but I totally encourage it because I want y'all to be thinking about applications of this stuff. So these are some questions that you can answer in the comment section below this video, and feel free to answer one, the other, or both. So question number 1, and you could just pause this and then type your answers in the comments without letting it run out of time. But what child development theory do you identify with most? Maturation, psychodynamic, psychosocial, cognitive behaviorist, ecological, information processing theory, and why? And you can go back to earlier in this video where I had that chart of the different kinds if you want to go back to that for referencing, or you can just Google these on a separate tab. And then question number 2, how do you relate to Selman's framework for friendship? What aspects of it do you relate to in your own friendship building experiences? Feel free to leave your answers in the comments below. Thank you guys for listening to this lecture, and I hope that it was helpful for you. Feel free to pose any other questions that you have for me in the comment section as well. Thank you.